There is a particular kind of silence that fills a room when a man believes he has won everything, and everyone around him already knows he has not.
That should take care of
That
everything.
silence belonged to Thomas Reeves on the morning he sat at the head of a mahogany table, pen in hand, signing the document that would make Vanessa Cole the chief operating officer of a company worth more than $1 billion. He believed this was his decision to make. He believed the company bore his name because it was, in every meaningful way, his creation. He smiled as he signed, unaware that 3 people in that room were watching him with the quiet discomfort of people who know a truth that has not yet been spoken aloud. He would remember that morning for the rest of his life, though not for the reasons he expected. What Thomas did not know was simple, and it was devastating. He did not know that the woman he had spent 7 years building a life with, the woman who rarely attended board meetings and never raised her voice in strategy sessions, held something none of his lawyers, none of his executives, and certainly not his mistress had ever told him. Margaret Reeves was not a quiet wife who had stepped back from the business to raise a family and support her husband's ambitions. Margaret Reeves owned the company, not a portion of it, not a symbolic seat on the board. The majority of it, structured so carefully, so patiently, that even the man who called himself CEO had no idea whose signature would ultimately decide whether his own would mean anything at all. Every person in that boardroom that day carried a version of the truth Thomas did not have. The general counsel knew, the chief financial officer knew, even the assistant who poured the coffee that morning understood something Thomas had never been told in 7 years of marriage and 5 years of running the company he thought belonged to him alone. They watched him sign Vanessa's promotion with the practiced neutrality of people trained not to react, not to glance at one another, not to give away the quiet tension humming beneath the surface of an ordinary Tuesday morning. Thomas mistook their silence for approval. He would not learn until much later that silence, in that room, meant something else entirely. There is something almost unbearable about watching a person walk confidently toward a truth they cannot see, and that morning, everyone in that boardroom carried the particular discomfort of witnesses to a moment they knew would not survive contact with reality. The stenographer hired to document the meeting's minutes would later say she had rarely felt a room so charged with unspoken information. Executives trading glances that lasted half a second too long, a junior associate suddenly fascinated by the papers in front of her, rather than the scene unfolding across the table. Thomas noticed none of it. He was too consumed by the satisfaction of the moment, too certain that this signature represented the natural culmination of everything he had spent years building, to register the quiet current of dread moving through the room around him. Vanessa Cole believed this was her moment. She had worked for this promotion, maneuvered for it, convinced herself she had earned it through merit and through the relationship she had built with the man she believed controlled every lever of power inside the company. She did not know that her name on that COO contract meant nothing without a second signature, one that did not belong to Thomas, one that had never even crossed her mind as a possibility. She smiled at Thomas from across the table as he signed, unaware that the empire she thought she was inheriting had a gatekeeper she had never once considered. That gatekeeper was not in the room, not yet. Somewhere else that morning, far from the boardroom, Margaret Reeves sat alone with a folder she had kept for years, a folder containing the original incorporation documents, the shareholder agreements, the quiet paper trail of a company she had built from nothing before Thomas ever walked into her life. She had watched for a long time the direction things were moving. She had said nothing, not out of weakness, but because she was waiting for the exact moment when saying nothing would no longer serve her. That morning, as Thomas signed away authority he did not actually possess, Margaret made a decision of her own. She reached for her pen. There was a document sitting inside that company's legal files that Thomas Reeves had never seen, never asked about, and never once suspected existed. It bore his wife's name, in ink far older than his own signature, and it carried the kind of authority no promotion, no title, and no boardroom performance could ever override. Thomas believed he had just made Vanessa Cole the second most powerful person in his company. He had no idea that the most powerful person in that company had been sitting across from him at dinner tables, in family photographs, and in quiet, unremarkable mornings for years, waiting for the exact right moment to remind everyone, including him, who the company had always truly belonged to. To understand how a man could reach this moment without ever suspecting the truth surrounding him, you first have to understand three people, each moving through the same story with a completely different set of facts. Thomas Reeves believed himself to be the architect of an empire, a man whose vision and instincts had built something extraordinary from ordinary beginnings. Margaret Reeves knew otherwise, and had known it for years, choosing silence not out of submission, but out of a calculation only she fully understood. Vanessa Cole believed she was stepping into power she had rightfully earned, unaware that the very foundation she stood on had never belonged to the man who promised it to her. Three people, three versions of the truth. Only one of them was real. The questions this story raises are not simple ones. Why would a woman who built $1 billion company from nothing choose to remain invisible within it for years, allowing her own husband to receive credit for work that was fundamentally hers? What does it say about a marriage when one partner spends years constructing a version of reality the other partner never once questions? And perhaps most importantly, what happens the moment that carefully constructed illusion collides with the ambition of a woman who has no idea she is standing in the middle of somebody else's long, patient reckoning? These are not questions with easy answers, and the path toward understanding them requires going back to where each of these three lives actually began. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. To understand how a man could stand in a boardroom, his own wife controlled without knowing it, you have to go back more than a decade to a version of Margaret Reeves who bore little resemblance to the composed, watchful woman she would later become. She started the company alone, in a converted garage on the outskirts of Austin, Texas, with nothing but a business degree, a small inheritance from her grandmother, and an idea nobody else believed in yet. She worked 18-hour days for years, built relationships with early investors through sheer persistence, and slowly turned a struggling logistics startup into something the industry began to notice. By the time she met Thomas at an industry conference in Dallas, Margaret was already the sole owner of a company quietly generating serious revenue, though she rarely spoke about it in detail. Even then, Margaret's early years running the company were marked by a kind of loneliness few people around her fully understood. She turned down 2 acquisition offers in her late 20s, both substantial enough to have made her wealthy for life, because she believed the company could become something far larger if she stayed patient. She hired her first employees out of a rented office space above a hardware store, promising salaries she could barely afford in the early months, betting everything on her own instincts about where the logistics industry was heading. Friends from business school assumed she had abandoned the venture after a few difficult years of silence, unaware she was quietly securing contracts with regional distributors that would eventually become the backbone of a national operation. She built all of this without a partner, without a co-founder, and without anyone to share the weight of decisions that could have destroyed everything she had worked for. Thomas Reeves was charming in the way ambitious men often are, confident, well-spoken, hungry for a version of success he had not yet built for himself. He worked in business development at a mid-sized firm, competent but unremarkable, and he was immediately drawn to Margaret's quiet intensity, the way she spoke about her company with a kind of restrained pride rather than boastful confidence. Margaret, for her part, found something appealing in his energy, his willingness to dream bigger than his current position allowed. They married 2 years later, and Margaret made a decision that would shape everything that followed. She invited Thomas into the company as an executive, gave him real responsibility, real visibility, and a title that suggested equal partnership, all while quietly retaining full ownership through a holding structure she never discussed at dinner. It was not deception in the way people would later assume. In the beginning, Margaret genuinely wanted Thomas to feel like a builder, not a passenger. She stepped back from public-facing leadership deliberately, let him become the face of the company in interviews, industry panels, and eventually national business press, because she believed a strong partnership meant sharing the spotlight, even if she never shared the paperwork. For years, this arrangement worked precisely because Thomas never asked the right questions, and Margaret never volunteered the answers. She told herself she was protecting the marriage from the complications of visible power imbalance. She did not yet know how much that silence would eventually cost her, or how convincingly Thomas would come to believe the company had always been equally his. As the company grew from a regional logistics firm into a billion-dollar national operation, Thomas's public identity grew with it. Magazine profiles called him a self-made visionary. Employees referred to him simply as the boss, rarely mentioning Margaret at all, since she attended fewer meetings, skipped most public events, and increasingly worked from home under the explanation that she preferred operations over spotlight. Thomas did not question this. He absorbed the credit easily, the way people do when praise arrives consistently enough to feel earned. Somewhere in those years, the man who once admired his wife's brilliance began quietly believing the empire had been his own doing from the start, a belief Margaret watched take root without correcting it, for reasons even she could not fully explain to herself at the time. Vanessa Cole's story began far from that boardroom, in a small town outside Columbus, Ohio, where she grew up the eldest daughter of a single mother who worked 2 jobs to keep their household afloat. Vanessa learned early that nothing in her life would be handed to her, and she built an identity around outworking everyone in every room she entered. She earned a scholarship to a respected business program, graduated near the top of her class, and spent her 20s climbing through a series of operations roles at companies that never quite recognized her potential the way she believed she deserved. She carried a quiet resentment about being repeatedly overlooked for promotions that went to less capable colleagues, a resentment that shaped her into someone fiercely determined never to be underestimated again. When Vanessa joined Thomas and Margaret's company as a director of operations, she arrived with a reputation for precision and relentless work ethic, qualities that made her stand out almost immediately among her peers. She had spent years watching other people receive credit for her ideas, and she was determined this company would be different, a place where her contributions would finally be seen and rewarded appropriately. Thomas noticed her talent quickly, perhaps too quickly, drawn not only to her competence, but to the hunger he recognized in her, a hunger that mirrored his own. Vanessa, for her part, saw in Thomas a leader who seemed to genuinely value her insight, someone willing to hand her real responsibility rather than sideline her the way previous employers had. She had no reason to suspect that the power structure she believed she understood was, in fact, only half the story. Their professional relationship shifted gradually, the way these things often do. Long dinners that started as strategy sessions, late-night calls that stopped being strictly about work, a closeness that neither of them named honestly for a long time. Vanessa told herself, in the beginning, that the growing intimacy between them was simply the natural result of working closely with someone who respected her mind, someone who made her feel, for the first time in her career, that her ambition was an asset rather than a threat. She did not initially set out to become involved with a married man, and in quieter moments, she struggled with the choices she was making. But the professional validation Thomas offered proved difficult for her to walk away from, especially after years of feeling invisible in every previous role she had held. Margaret noticed the shift in her husband long before anyone confirmed it to her directly. She noticed the late nights, the sudden defensiveness, the way Thomas began speaking about Vanessa with an admiration that felt different from ordinary professional respect. She said nothing at first, choosing instead to watch, to gather information quietly, the same way she had once gathered investors, methodically and without emotion clouding her judgment. It was during this period that Margaret began revisiting the original incorporation paperwork, the shareholder agreements drafted years earlier, reviewing the structure of a company she had never stopped legally controlling, even as the world around her assumed otherwise. She was not building a case for revenge. She was simply preparing, in case preparation ever became necessary. By the time whispers of an affair reached her through a trusted former colleague, Margaret had already renewed her controlling shareholder documentation, quietly, through her own attorney, without informing Thomas or anyone at the company. She did not confront him. She did not create a scene. Instead, she watched him grow closer to Vanessa Cole with the same patient, unreadable calm she had once used to grow a company from nothing. Those close to Margaret would later describe this period as the quietest, most controlled version of her they had ever witnessed, a woman absorbing painful truths about her marriage while simultaneously reinforcing her legal grip on everything Thomas believed was rightfully his alone. The weeks leading up to Vanessa Cole's promotion moved with a kind of deliberate momentum, the sort Thomas Reeves mistook for simple business efficiency. He had decided, without any formal pushback from his executive team, that the company needed a chief operating officer, someone who understood the day-to-day machinery of the business as intimately as he understood its public image. He told himself this decision was strategic, a natural next step for a growing empire. He did not examine too closely why the person he kept picturing in that role was Vanessa Cole, a woman whose competence he genuinely respected, and whose company he had come to crave, in ways that extended well beyond the office. Thomas moved forward the way confident men often do, certain that authority alone would make the decision final. He began floating the idea in smaller meetings first, testing reactions among senior staff before bringing it to the full board. Most executives responded with practiced neutrality, the kind of careful diplomacy people offer when they sense something is happening that they are not fully permitted to comment on. One longtime operations manager, a woman named Carol Whitfield, who had been with the company since its earliest days in that Austin garage, felt an unease she could not quite articulate. She had worked alongside Margaret Reeves long before Thomas ever entered the picture, and something about watching him maneuver Vanessa into a position of real power struck her as deeply, quietly wrong, though she could not have explained why without revealing more than she believed was hers to reveal. Carol had watched Margaret build the company from its earliest days, back when payroll was met some months only, through Margaret's own personal savings. She remembered the version of Margaret who slept on a cot in the office during the company's first product launch, who negotiated with suppliers twice her age and refused to be dismissed. Watching Thomas take credit for that history in interviews over the years had never sat comfortably with Carol, though she understood it was not her place to correct the narrative Margaret herself had allowed to take shape. Now, watching him prepare to hand significant power to a woman he was involved with behind his wife's back, Carol felt a discomfort sharpen into something closer to certainty that a reckoning, of some kind, was quietly approaching. Vanessa spent those same weeks preparing herself mentally for the responsibility ahead, reading operational reports late into the night, familiarizing herself with departments she would soon oversee, determined to prove that Thomas's confidence in her had been justified. For Vanessa, this promotion represented more than career advancement. It represented a kind of vindication after years of watching less capable colleagues rise past her in previous jobs, a chance to finally occupy a position where her judgment would carry real institutional weight. She allowed herself, in private moments, to imagine a future where she and Thomas ran the company together openly, a fantasy she rarely spoke aloud, but which had quietly taken root as she watched their relationship and her career intertwine more each month. Thomas scheduled the formal board meeting for a Tuesday morning, choosing the date with the kind of casual confidence of a man who did not anticipate resistance. He drafted the promotion documents himself, working with the company's legal team to prepare a contract that would grant Vanessa Cole full operational authority, a seat on the executive committee, and a compensation package befitting her new title. He reviewed the paperwork late one night, alone in his office, feeling something close to pride as he read through the language elevating the woman he had grown so attached to into the second highest position in a billion-dollar company. He did not think once, not for a moment, about whether his signature alone carried the weight he assumed it did. Margaret, meanwhile, continued her quiet routine, attending fewer meetings than ever, offering no visible objection to the promotion she had certainly heard about through the same informal channels that carried most sensitive information through the company. She said nothing to Thomas about it directly. She did not need to. She had already renewed her controlling shareholder documentation weeks earlier, quietly reasserting the legal authority she had held since the company's founding, an authority that made any major executive appointment, including a COO promotion, subject to her approval whether Thomas realized it or not. She watched from a distance as her husband prepared to hand significant power to the woman he was betraying her with, and she allowed the process to continue, patiently, almost curiously, waiting to see how far he would go before reality intervened. The morning of the board meeting arrived with an atmosphere Thomas interpreted as celebratory anticipation, but which felt, to those paying closer attention, distinctly heavier than that. Vanessa arrived early, dressed carefully, visibly aware that this day would define the next chapter of her career. She greeted board members with practiced warmth, unaware that several of them exchanged glances that carried more meaning than any words could have. General Counsel had reviewed the promotion contract days earlier and understood precisely what Thomas did not: that no executive appointment of this magnitude could become legally binding without a secondary signature belonging to the majority shareholder. He said nothing. It was not his place to reveal what Margaret herself had chosen to withhold. Thomas stood at the head of the table, delivering a brief, confident speech about growth, leadership, and the future of the company, before sliding the contract across the polished wood toward Vanessa Cole. She signed first, her hand steady, her smile unmistakable. Thomas signed next, feeling, in that moment, an overwhelming sense of control, the culmination of years spent believing he had built this empire through his own vision and determination. He did not glance toward the folder sitting quietly in the company's legal files, the one containing Margaret's original shareholder agreement, updated and notarized weeks earlier. He did not know it existed. Neither did Vanessa. Only a handful of people in that room understood that the contract they had just witnessed meant nothing without one more signature, a signature that did not belong to either of them. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. In the days following the board meeting, Thomas Reeves moved through the company with the satisfaction of a man who believed he had just secured his legacy. He introduced Vanessa Cole to senior staff in her new capacity, watched her settle into a larger office down the hall from his own, and allowed himself to imagine a future where the two of them ran the company together, publicly this time, without the careful discretion they had once maintained. What Thomas did not notice, or perhaps chose not to notice, was the peculiar delay that followed. The formal paperwork finalizing Vanessa's promotion, the documents meant to update her title across every legal and financial record the company maintained, remained unprocessed. Human Resources cited routine administrative review. Legal cited standard procedural timelines. Thomas accepted these explanations without much thought, distracted by the momentum of his own confidence. Carol Whitfield, the longtime operations manager who had quietly sensed something wrong from the beginning, noticed the delay immediately and understood, better than most, what it likely meant. She had seen Margaret Reeves operate this way before, patient, deliberate, allowing situations to unfold at their own pace rather than forcing confrontation prematurely. Carol remembered a similar pattern years earlier, when a supplier had attempted to renegotiate a contract in bad faith, and Margaret had said nothing publicly for weeks, while quietly securing a replacement partnership behind the scenes, only revealing her hand once the supplier had no leverage left. Carol trusted, without needing an explanation, that whatever was happening now was unfolding exactly as Margaret intended, and she found herself watching Thomas with a mixture of sympathy and quiet dread. Vanessa, for her part, began noticing small inconsistencies that unsettled her confidence. Her new title had not yet appeared on the company's official leadership page. Certain financial systems she expected access to as COO remained locked, with IT citing unspecified compliance reviews. She raised these concerns with Thomas directly, and he, in turn, raised them with legal, growing increasingly irritated by what he assumed was simple bureaucratic incompetence. He had no framework for understanding that the holdup originated from an authority above his own, because he did not yet know that such an authority existed. His irritation grew into something closer to suspicion, though he directed that suspicion entirely in the wrong direction, wondering aloud to close colleagues whether a rival executive might be quietly sabotaging Vanessa's transition out of jealousy or personal resentment. Vanessa privately began to feel a familiar anxiety resurface, the same feeling she had carried through years of previous jobs where recognition seemed to slip through her fingers just as she reached for it. She told herself this situation was different, that Thomas held real authority and would resolve the delay in her favor, but a quiet, persistent doubt crept into her thinking during long nights alone with her concerns. She had built her entire identity around never again allowing herself to be overlooked, and the growing uncertainty surrounding her promotion triggered something deeper than simple professional frustration. She began reviewing her own position within the company more critically, wondering, for the first time, whether she truly understood the full landscape of power she had entered. Rumors began circulating through the company's upper ranks, vague at first, then increasingly specific. Some employees whispered that the promotion had stalled due to concerns from outside investors. Others suggested Vanessa's rapid rise had triggered internal politics from executives who felt overlooked. A junior board member speculated privately that the company's legal team had flagged a compliance issue tied to conflict of interest policies, given the well-known closeness between Thomas and Vanessa, though even this theory failed to capture the actual reason. Thomas found himself increasingly paranoid, reviewing old emails, questioning the loyalty of colleagues he had trusted for years, convinced that someone within his own leadership team was working against him. He never once considered that the person holding real power over the situation was his own wife. Margaret continued her quiet observation from a distance, monitoring the situation not through direct confrontation, but through the same channels she had always relied upon: brief conversations with longtime employees like Carol, careful reviews of internal communications her position still entitled her to access, and the occasional conversation with her attorney, confirming that her legal standing remained fully intact. She felt no urgency to intervene further. The delay itself was doing exactly what she needed it to do, creating just enough friction to expose the fragility of an arrangement built entirely on assumptions Thomas had never bothered to verify. Margaret had spent years building patience into a kind of discipline, and she intended to let that discipline carry her the rest of the way toward the moment she had been quietly preparing for. Nearly 3 weeks after the original board meeting, Thomas requested an emergency meeting with legal counsel, demanding a clear explanation for what he now considered an unacceptable delay in finalizing Vanessa's role. He sat across from the same general counsel who had witnessed his signature weeks earlier, the same man who had known from the very beginning that Thomas's authority alone had never been sufficient. This time, the attorney could no longer deflect with vague procedural language. Margaret had instructed him, calmly and clearly, that the moment had come to reveal what Thomas had never known. The attorney took a slow breath, opened a folder Thomas had never seen before, and began explaining. For the first time in 7 years of marriage and 5 years of running a company he believed was entirely his own, exactly whose signature had been missing from Vanessa Cole's promotion all along. Thomas sat in stunned silence as the attorney explained, in careful, measured language, that Margaret Reeves held majority ownership of the company through a holding entity established years before Thomas had ever joined the business in any official capacity. The attorney explained that this structure had never changed, that Margaret's controlling stake had simply remained undisclosed in the day-to-day operations of a company Thomas believed he had built and led on equal footing with his wife. Thomas asked the same question 3 times, as though repetition might alter the answer. Each time, the attorney confirmed the same devastating fact: no executive appointment of consequence, including Vanessa Cole's promotion to Chief Operating Officer, could become legally binding without Margaret's signature, and Margaret had chosen, deliberately, not to provide it. The room felt smaller to Thomas than it ever had before, though nothing physical about it had changed. He thought back over years of magazine profiles, industry panels, and interviews where he had spoken about vision and leadership as though the company's success belonged to him, in ways he now understood it never fully had. He thought about Margaret's quiet presence at home, her calm demeanor during company events, her willingness to let him occupy the spotlight while she remained comfortably, almost invisibly, in the background. None of it had been passive. All of it, he now realized, had been a choice she made consistently, patiently, for reasons he was only beginning to understand, as the full weight of her authority settled over him like something he could no longer outrun or explain away. Margaret requested a formal board meeting for the following week, and this time she attended in person, something she had rarely done in recent years. She walked into the same boardroom where Thomas had signed Vanessa's promotion contract weeks earlier, carrying with her the original incorporation documents, the shareholder agreements, and the renewed controlling stake paperwork her attorney had already shared privately with the board's legal counsel. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. She simply laid the documents on the table, the same table where Thomas had once felt so certain of his own authority, and explained, calmly, to a room full of executives who had spent years assuming Thomas alone held ultimate power, that she had built this company from nothing, retained ownership of it throughout her marriage, and would now be exercising her right to reject the promotion in question entirely. Every executive in that room, save for legal counsel, absorbed the revelation with visible shock, several exchanging glances that finally made sense of years of small, unexplained observations, Margaret's quiet influence over certain decisions, her occasional presence at meetings she technically had no formal reason to attend, the deference certain senior staff members had always shown her without ever fully explaining why. Carol Whitfield, seated near the back of the room, felt something close to relief, watching a truth she had long suspected finally surface in full view. She had waited years for this moment, without ever knowing exactly what form it would take, and watching Margaret speak with such calm, unshakable authority confirmed everything Carol had believed about the woman who had built this company from a converted garage. Vanessa Cole sat frozen through the entire explanation, watching the foundation of everything she believed she had earned collapse in real time. She realized, with a clarity that arrived far too late to change anything, that she had never been climbing toward real power at all. She had been positioned, unknowingly, as the instrument through which Margaret would finally expose the imbalance Thomas had spent years failing to acknowledge, even to himself. Vanessa's competence had never been in question, but her understanding of the true structure surrounding her had been fundamentally, catastrophically incomplete. She looked toward Thomas for some kind of explanation, some reassurance that he had known more than he appeared to, but his expression offered her nothing, because he had known nothing either. In that moment, Vanessa felt the full weight of a pattern she recognized from earlier in her career, the sensation of having worked hard toward something, only to discover the ground beneath her had never been solid to begin with. Unlike her previous experiences, however, this collapse carried far greater consequences, tied not just to a missed promotion, but to a relationship she had allowed to compromise her judgment in ways she now viewed with painful clarity. She thought of her mother, who had worked 2 jobs to give her a chance at a different kind of life, and felt a shame she had not anticipated, understanding that ambition, unchecked by caution, had led her into a situation that could unravel everything she had worked so hard to build for herself. Margaret addressed the board with the same measured tone she had used throughout her career, explaining that her decision to remain quiet about her ownership had never been about deception for its own sake, but about protecting a marriage and a partnership she once believed in fully. She explained that she had watched, patiently, as that partnership eroded, choosing to wait rather than react, gathering clarity rather than acting from anger. She stated plainly that she had renewed her controlling documentation the moment she recognized the direction things were heading, not out of vindictiveness, but out of a simple, unwavering commitment to protecting the company she had spent her entire adult life building from nothing. The room listened in a silence that felt entirely different from the silence that had once surrounded Thomas's confident signature weeks before. Thomas attempted to speak, to offer some version of an explanation or defense, but found that the words available to him felt insufficient against the scale of what had just been revealed. He looked at Margaret, searching her face for some flicker of the anger he assumed she must be suppressing, but found instead something far more unsettling, a calm, unwavering resolve that suggested she had made peace with this moment long before he ever understood it was coming. Vanessa's promotion, effective immediately, was formally rejected by majority shareholder authority. The company's leadership structure remained unchanged, at least on paper, though everyone in that room understood that nothing about the balance of power inside that company, or inside Thomas Reeves's marriage, would ever return to what it had been before that Tuesday morning. In the weeks that followed the board meeting, the company outwardly appeared unchanged. Employees returned to their routines, quarterly targets continued as scheduled, and the public-facing image of the business remained intact, largely because Margaret Reeves made a deliberate choice not to let the internal upheaval spill into headlines or industry gossip. She had built too much, over too many years, to allow personal betrayal to damage something that still employed hundreds of people who had nothing to do with the choices Thomas had made. This restraint surprised many who expected her to seek a more public reckoning. Instead, Margaret handled the situation the same way she had built the company itself, quietly, deliberately, and with an eye toward long-term consequences rather than immediate satisfaction. Thomas requested a private meeting with Margaret nearly 2 weeks after the board's decision, hoping to salvage what remained of his position within the company, if not his marriage. Margaret agreed to meet him, not out of sentimentality, but because she believed the situation deserved a clear, final resolution rather than lingering ambiguity. She listened as Thomas offered explanations that sounded, even to him, increasingly hollow, attempts to frame the affair as a symptom of feeling overshadowed, a search for validation he claimed he had stopped receiving at home. Margaret did not raise her voice or interrupt him. She simply waited until he finished, then explained, calmly, that his sense of being overshadowed had never matched reality, since she had spent years deliberately allowing him to occupy the spotlight she could have claimed for herself at any point. Thomas asked her, toward the end of that conversation, why she had never simply told him the truth from the beginning, why she had allowed him to believe, for years, in a version of their partnership that had never actually existed. Margaret considered the question carefully before answering, telling him that she had genuinely wanted an equal partnership, one built on trust rather than legal documentation, and that revealing her ownership early might have changed the way he saw himself and the way he saw her in ways she had hoped to avoid. She admitted, quietly, that perhaps her silence had allowed him to develop a version of confidence untethered from reality, a mistake she now recognized as her own, even as she made clear that his choice to betray her trust remained entirely his. Rather than pursuing a public dismantling of Thomas's career, Margaret proposed something that startled even her own legal team. She offered Thomas a structured exit from his role as chief executive officer, one that included a severance package and a graceful, mutually agreed-upon public explanation, citing a shift toward new leadership. She did not do this out of forgiveness, and she made that distinction clear to those closest to her. She did it because she understood that dismantling him publicly would ultimately reflect more on her judgment in choosing him than on his own failures, and because she valued the company's stability far more than she valued watching him suffer. Thomas accepted the offer, recognizing he had little leverage left to negotiate from, and recognizing, perhaps for the first time, the full scope of the power Margaret had always quietly possessed. Vanessa Cole's departure from the company followed shortly after, though her exit lacked the careful diplomacy extended to Thomas. She had no ownership stake, no long history with the business, and no relationship with Margaret that warranted the same consideration. She left quietly, without a severance negotiation, without a curated public explanation, understanding only that she had been used as an unwitting instrument in a conflict she never fully understood until it was far too late to protect herself from its consequences. Colleagues who once admired her rapid rise now spoke of her departure in hushed, cautious tones, uncertain how much of the situation had been her doing and how much had simply happened around her. Vanessa herself would later describe the experience as the moment she learned that proximity to power is not the same as possessing it. In the months following her departure, Vanessa struggled to rebuild professionally, finding that word of the scandal, though never made fully public, had traveled quietly through industry circles in the way such things often do. She took a lower-level position at a smaller firm in Cincinnati, closer to her mother, and spent considerable time reflecting on the choices that had led her there. She came to understand that her hunger to be seen and valued, forged from years of genuine hardship, had made her vulnerable to a situation she should have questioned far sooner. She did not view herself purely as a victim, acknowledging her own role in the affair, but she recognized, too, that she had entered a structure of power far more complicated than anyone had allowed her to see, and that recognition became, in time, a kind of hard-won wisdom she carried into every position she held afterward. Margaret Reeves resumed a more visible role within the company in the months that followed, stepping into public view for the first time in years, granting interviews that finally told the story she had spent so long allowing others to tell incompletely. She spoke about the discipline required to build something from nothing, about the choice to remain quiet during her marriage, not out of weakness, but out of a belief in partnership that ultimately proved misplaced. She spoke about patience, about the difference between reacting and responding, and about the quiet, unglamorous work of protecting something you have built with your own hands, even when the people closest to you fail to see its true value. Her story began circulating widely, not as a tale of revenge, but as a lesson in the cost of underestimating someone who chooses silence deliberately rather than out of necessity. Carol Whitfield remained with the company for years afterward, eventually stepping into a senior leadership role Margaret created specifically to recognize the loyalty and quiet integrity Carol had demonstrated since the company's earliest days. The two women rarely spoke directly about the events surrounding Thomas and Vanessa, but an understanding existed between them that required no explanation. The kind of understanding built between people who have watched each other work hard, stay patient, and ultimately be proven right about the things that matter most. Carol would later tell a younger colleague that the most important lesson she had learned from watching Margaret was that real power rarely needs to announce itself loudly, and that the people who understand this best are often the ones underestimated the longest. Thomas Reeves faded from public relevance far more quickly than he ever imagined possible, a reflection of how much of his professional identity had been built upon a company he never actually controlled. He attempted, in the following years, to launch a smaller venture of his own, hoping to prove that his earlier success had not been entirely dependent on Margaret's foundation, but the new company struggled to gain the traction his previous position had once commanded. He would later admit, in a rare moment of candor to a former colleague, that the hardest realization was not losing his position or his marriage, but understanding how completely he had misjudged the woman he had spent years standing beside without ever truly seeing. Margaret Reeves, meanwhile, continued building, expanding the company into new markets, mentoring a new generation of leaders, and demonstrating, quietly and consistently, that true power rarely announces itself. She never remarried, choosing instead to pour the energy she once split between marriage and business fully into the company and into a small circle of people who had earned her trust through years of consistency rather than charm. Those closest to her would say she carried no bitterness about what had happened, only a clear, unsentimental understanding of what she valued and what she would no longer tolerate. Sometimes, true power simply waits, patiently, for the exact moment when silence has finally done all the work it was ever meant to do. Would you have recognized the warning signs as clearly as Margaret did, or would ambition have blinded you, the way it blinded Thomas and Vanessa both? Let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos.